Today we're joined by Dan Hill, who's a Ph.D., and he is an expert in reading body language. And from what I understand, you'll have to correct me if I get it wrong, but you've developed a software that helps actually read and interpret facial expressions and body language.
No, not so much. There are efforts underway to automate facial coding, but I still do the work manually because if you go through and you study it expression by expression in slow motion, you can do a much better job. So as far as I've gone down the automation route, is I have something called a facial action coding studio. It allows me to slow motion, freeze frame, replay the video 30 frames per second. So I can very precisely look at what's happening. And then I can hit the right, keypad, button to say, okay, it was this expression versus that expression. It'll keep track of it for me when it happened, which one it was. It knows which emotions that expression correlates to, and it runs a scoring system that I developed and have a patent for.
Okay, but you're driving it. So I'm not going to say AI or something. So is it like a radiologist when they're looking at something and maybe they have a computer that can narrow in on spots, and then they go, "Oh, zoom in on that. Let me look at that and pick a spot."
Very much so. And in fact, also like radiologists, the more you do it, if you have any talent for it, the better you're going to get. So the reason I'm probably a facial coder in part, autobiographically, is my family moved to Italy when I was 6 years old. Mm-hmm. I went to Italian first grade in a fishing village. I did not know Italian at first. I had to read the nonverbals. Fortunately, Italians have a lot of them. And so I largely spent my day looking at how people were reacting. The next thing that happened to me is my mom happened to be an interior designer. We go to Amsterdam on the way home to the U.S. after our 2 years. We stop at the Rijksmuseum, and I fall in love with Rembrandt, basically on the spot. Rembrandt, of course, is celebrated for being great at capturing people's expressions. And I think that was the 1-2 punch that kind of set this up for where I was going to eventually go in life, though it took a while.
Very interesting. Have you heard of Joe Navarro?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Okay. He's FBI agent and considered probably one of the leading experts in the field of body language. He was a Cuban who moved here to America and didn't speak English to start. So he had to learn how to read expressions, and that was sort of his beginning. So
I think anytime you're an outsider and you have to step in, it might be a language barrier, cultural differences. I just think it makes you more alert to your surroundings. I think women are often great at noticing their surroundings. There's a wonderful stanza from a poem by Wallace Stevens who said, "A duchess is not a duchess 100 yards from the carriage. Women understand this." In other words, women, maybe being a little more physically vulnerable, have to be very aware of their context and what's safe and not safe. And yes, the Duchess, too far from the carriage, no longer has the power and the privilege that comes with being a Duchess. She's now just a person and vulnerable like everybody else. So yes, I think it works. I do know about Joe's work. This is used in national security issues, FBI, the CIA. In fact, I was going to be giving a speech in Beijing some years ago. I was at the Great Wall. I'm talking to someone. He says, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "Well, I'm a market researcher." He looked really bored. I know this because I'm a facial coder. I said, "Well, it's a bit more interesting than that. I'm a facial coder." And he goes, "Oh, micro expressions." And I said, "Well, that's not exactly a household term, that being micro expression being a really quick expression that flits across the face." And I said, "So now you have to tell me what you do for a living." And he said, "Well, officially I work for Halliburton." He said, "Actually, I'm the substation chief for the CIA in Saudi Arabia, and I've used the tool for 15 years for interrogation and surveillance purposes." So we broke out from the group for about an hour and had a really interesting conversation about things you won't find in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm very into body language and influence and persuasion. They all kind of roll together in my mind.
Yeah.
Because, why do you read body language? Well, you have to do something with it. I mean, if they're angry with you, you're going to probably change the way you're reacting. Or if they're happy, or if you're trying to interrogate or find out information. So I think that body language is just one of a piece or one spoke on a wheel.
Yeah, it gives you a tool in a situation. There's a wonderful study from UCLA. They said there are ambiguous situations in life. It could be a sales meeting, being hired for a job, being on a first date, God knows what. They said in those situations, they believe that the true communication was 55% from the face, 38% from the voice, and merely 7% from the words.
That
So if
was
you
some
want
Arabian
yeah,
study, and that's actually
yes, it is.
pretty. That has been misinterpreted in a lot of ways. So, can we visit on that a little bit to make sure that we get it right?
Sure,
Because
sure.
a lot of people will say that, oh, well, that, yeah, if you look at communication, that's such and such is nonverbal and the words don't matter. And it's like, oh, really? Well, then go ahead and you tell me what I'm saying with no words. You tell me what I'm thinking.
True, but the key was he talked about ambiguous situations
Got
where
it.
you do not believe that the words are very reliable as an index. So that's the key qualifier there. And, it's not a gigantic sample size, but I think it's an
Mhm.
interesting barometer of the fact that anyone who depends on the words alone, I won't say dispense with the words. I've got a PhD in English. I like words. I've written 8 books. I'd like to think words can do a few things for us.
Oh, sure. And
On the other hand, if you've never been lied to in life, congratulations. You're either really lucky or you're not paying attention.
you know what's funny is that people are more forthright with words than you sometimes realize. And they don't even know they're saying it. I don't know. I know you've covered presidential debates before, but I can't help but think about a recent one with Michael Bloomberg.
Yes, yeah, he got sunk rather readily.
Well, he came out and talked about the congressman who helped take over and said, I gave $100 million. And then he said, I bought,
And then he
gave.
stopped. Yes, yes.
I just thought that was funny. Now, have you found that, especially when you're looking at the cues, are you only looking at expressions? Because I know there's a theory that you can see who will win a debate by turning your sound down and just watching them, and you can kind of see who's going to overall win.
Yeah, no, I did something similar for Shark Tank episodes.
Oh,
I just looked to see whether or not the sharks were going to likely make a bid for the entrepreneur's business, and I was very accurate.
what's
Uh,
the determining factor? Because I've had Scott Rouse on, who also does body language, and he was known as the pitch guy. So he would go in, and as he put it, if you're pitching people and they're going, oh, yeah, oh, that's great, oh, yeah, you're never going to get it. He said, you're looking for the one who almost looks like they're constipated. Almost looks like he said, because they're thinking about it. He said they're actually calculating in their mind, can I pay this to get that? Or can I do this to get that? Does that match up, or did you find something different?
No, I think it does match up. There's one of these 23 expressions with facial coding is where the eyebrows lower and kind of pinch together, and
Mm-hmm.
you get a vertical crease between the eyebrows. So that shows someone's ruminating on something. They're kind of turning over those numbers and scenarios and trying to imagine it works. They could also be narrowing the lips a bit. Anger is sometimes a negative emotion. Obviously, you get into a violent barroom brawl.
Sure.
But anger can also be that you're concentrating, you want to make progress, you want to figure out what's that path to your ultimate goal. So a smile can be at the end of the equation. Yes, a smile can indicate you're open, you're embracing an offer, an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also true that a smile, just like anger has an upside and a downside, the downside to happiness is you're kind of being loose with the facts. You're just a happy camper. And
Social lubricant.
yeah, and you're not so worried about things. I think a successful shark is going to be pretty careful with the details, starting with their money. And so a big loopy smile probably means they're actually amused by you, but they're laughing at you and the implausibility of your growth curve as opposed to, yeah, I'm going to jump in and team up with this person.
Well, it's funny too, because there have been studies that have shown that, well, I hate to say it, but liars are more likable.
Yeah, they're really good. They can be smooth talkers. They don't hesitate. They make it comfortable for us and just kind of bring us along stage by stage. I was fooled making a purchase not long ago, and she was very smooth. And I went home and checked it out, and I'd paid too much money. Yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah, but okay, being in the business you're in, do you kind of have to go, yeah, good job, you got me?
Yeah, I did, but I got her back in a small way at the end. She said, "So how old do you think I am?" And I think she was looking for a really young answer, and I said 32, and she says, "That's right, I'm 32."
Well, what's funny is when her reply is about to say, "Oh,
Yeah.
that is classic." All right, so while we're talking about that, what are things that people get wrong? Now, the crossed arms is probably the most common example of, okay, that means they're closed off. And it's like, no, it doesn't mean that. It could be they're cold. It could be, well, I'm standing here for a long time, my arms are tired, and I can just kind of rest them across my chest. What are some other things that we just get wrong?
I think we get wrong the fact that there's no lying muscle in the face. I mean, I endlessly get asked this question. Surely there must be one expression that gives away the fact that the person's lying. There isn't. If God meant it to be that simple, we would all head to the plastic surgeon or the Botox center and have that expression wiped out of our repertoire. You have
Botox
you have
does help, though, doesn't it?
well, it takes away the worry wrinkles. So it can make you, a little bit more placid and a little bit more, tip you a little bit more toward pure happiness instead. But the truth is Botox really works in just a couple of places.
Mm-hmm.
The face has 44 different sets of muscles, either side of the face, that can tie into facial expressions. So Botox, it doesn't even begin to cover the waterfront in terms of how you show expressions. So this whole thing with lying, some people will go to poker face. They'll try to not show anything on their face. Bernie Madoff showed contempt on his face very often. He didn't hold with respect the people he was, flummoxing and taking the money from. Richard Nixon was a bad liar. He showed fear. If you asked him the right question, the guy not only sweated like he famously did on the first Nixon-Kennedy debate, but his mouth would pull wide in fear. I take Bill Clinton on the other hand, so I want to be totally nonpartisan about this. He went to anger.
I was going to say anger is a good one and commonly used, right? Because it knocks people back on their heel a little bit too. So they're busy reacting that they may not be picking up what you're hiding. Is that a good analogy?
It is. How dare you doubt my veracity? So you kind of push back at them, maybe even really hard. Lance Armstrong would do the same sort of thing. As someone once said to me, if you're going to tell a lie, tell a big lie. People will be amazed by your audacity. And I think that's one of the pathways that liars will take. So there are a lot of different ways in which you can potentially, have a pattern that might relate to your lies. But there is absolutely no, reliable way to pick up that someone is dissembling. It just doesn't exist.
Cool. Let's talk about another one that I think is commonly used, but I think has been maybe disproven or it needs to be worked harder before it's used. And that's the Eac model or eye accessing cues.
Know nothing about it. Go ahead and tell me.
That's the whole, if I look up and to the left, that means that I am actually remembering, but if I look down to the right and I could be getting it wrong, that means I'm creating that whole thing.
Yeah, no, I've been on the stage or spoken at conferences with several of those people. Mm-hmm. And one time I even happened to drive the guy back to the airport and I said, forgive me, but I'm a bit of a skeptic. I said, I got a PhD. I do research. I like to see a paper trail. I said, facial coding, I believe in because I've got everything from Leonardo da Vinci to Charles Darwin to a professor named Paul Ekman. I said, tell me about the paper trail and I'll read the articles and maybe I can, get closer to accepting it. He had nothing. I said, here's my business card. Send me any links you got, articles. I said, I'll go to the library. I'll go to any university library. I'll dig. I'm happy to dig. I got nothing from the guy.
It's out of NLP, neuro programming,
yes,
by the way, if you ever want to dig in.
Yeah, that's the term I was looking for. Exactly.
Was it Bandler and I can't remember.
Non-linguistic programming, NLP, yes.
Neuro.
Okay, sorry.
I believe. But yeah, and it's a Bandler, and I forgot the other guy who created it. It's kind of out of the hypnosis world. It's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, when I first encountered facial coding, I was like, okay, is this really valid? But I started digging in, and you find enough sources. And Dr. Ekman, who I've now alluded to a couple of times, he's a really thorough guy. No one's infallible. I can't sit here and say facial coding is always going to get you the absolute ground truth of reality. but it can get you closer. And in this world, closer is maybe all you can hope for in some cases.
Well, you do something with your software, it sounds like, that's kind of similar. I've had a guest on in the past, and I refer to him a lot, Chase Hughes, who wrote the Ellipsis Manual, and he created something called the Behavioral Table of Elements. And what he does is he breaks down every expression, every movement, and he patterns them together into like a score. And this sounds similar in my mind to what you're talking about, where he won't take just one action. He'll take, and he watches a video and slows it down and plays it back, and it'll be, they did this expression followed by this item, followed by this item. If you add those together, that's a 13. Now, he's not saying that's a definitive lie. He's saying that that is something that should be explored.
Sure. So with facial coding, one thing you're doing is you're looking for where are the peaks, because an expression is kind of like a wave breaking on the shore. It gathers, it has a peak, and it lets go. In fact, if the rhythm is unnatural, there's a good chance someone's trying to pull the expression on their face. So things you can look for is when an expression is lopsided. That's actually a pretty good indication that they're kind of forcing the smile, for instance. Maybe the expression comes on too quickly. Politicians will do this. They'll flash the light bulb smile to try to hide the fear at the question. They have no idea how to answer. They'll also very expeditiously put away the smile. I call it the guillotine smile. It just drops off their face way too quickly. There's no natural fade to it. Like, now I'm going to put it back in my pocket. I deployed the smile. Now I'm done with it for the moment. There's also what I call the Energizer bunny smile. It just goes on and on and on. That is not natural. If someone laughs at your joke, Eric, for more than 3 seconds, they're probably brown-nosing you.
Oh boy, I'm in trouble.
Because
no,
that's 30 frames per second. That's 90 frames. In a facial coder's life, that's actually a lot of time. And so that peak should be a peak. It should not be a plateau. You're not going out to Montana to look at a butte. This is something that should be much quicker. And so those are some of the things I look for. But yes, then I get into, okay, I saw this expression and this expression, and you can track it. And so let's take something that's fairly important, surprise. With surprise, some of the ways it shows, for instance, is the eyes go wider, the eyebrows lift. You are quite literally trying to take in more information. You're opening your window of vision. And so a surprise is almost like a pre-emotion. If emotions are brief, like 3 seconds, 4 seconds, kind of things at the most, well, surprise is super quick. In most instances, surprise is going to be certainly less than a second. It might be 1/4 of a second. That's how long it happens. Because surprise can lead either to a positive verdict, a negative verdict, or an ambiguous verdict. So a positive verdict is, new car for Christmas. Negative verdict, new car, accident on the way home from work. Both of them are possible, but it's really in the sequence what comes after that. Did they start to feel some anger? Was there contempt? Was there happiness? Sure. What's the combination? And then is there an overlying pattern? Because some of these expressions go to just one emotion, but a number of other ones go to 2 or more emotions. So is there some commonality? Is there something that maybe stands out as kind of like the emotion of the moment, but there's maybe a subtext, a second emotion that plays into it? So for instance, maybe your reaction is contempt. I don't trust you. I don't respect you. But maybe the underlying emotion is a little bit of sadness, because maybe I thought you were someone who was going to be a good colleague, and suddenly now I am disappointed in you. So I not only disrespect you, but I'm also disappointed because I'd hoped for a better outcome. So that's where some of the richness starts to come into the interpretation. It's not cookie cutter like, there's one expression and this person has it for all time. That is really, once you get into facial coding and try to utilize the tool, that's not a satisfying way to use the tool at all.
Well, surprise is a very important element in comedy.
It is.
Which I think is because a joke in of itself is you're expecting one outcome and are hit from the side with a different outcome. And that surprise then leads into the reaction of the laughter.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute staple, and it can be on a comedy. It can also be on a cop show, quite honestly, because you're looking for twists in the plot. In daily life, so there's these 7 emotions, and in my book, Famous Faces Decoded, I have 173 celebrities, and surprise is about 8 to 10% of their emoting. When I look at TV shows, particularly comedies, the amount of emoting per character, if I just take an episode or two and go through them, is about 25%. Sometimes it's as much as 35%. So it is completely unnatural and beyond how we typically live our lives. But you're looking for the joke and the next joke and the sleight of hand, plot development, and so on and so forth. It's kind of like Crash Car Dummies. And that's what's happening on the screen for us.
Well, it's funny. I had Mark Bowden on, and he is another body language expert. He's been rated by Global Gurus, and we had talked about it on while we're being filmed here. What he recommends is you're looking up at a Post-it next to the camera. So I'm actually looking in your eyes right now, which means I'm looking in the camera. But as he put it, there's a lot of mechanisms that go into place to make something more real by being fake, which is a really contrary thing, but it is sort of true. It's like, if I look into the camera directly, I seem like I am more intimately looking in your eyes, even though now I can't see your image at all. You're just under me, and I'm essentially blinded to you. But I seem more authentic by being inauthentic.
Well, yes, and I'm always looking for that. I'll give you two quick stories. So the evening of the Iowa caucuses in 2008, I was both in the room, and I predicted that Huckabee was going to win. And then I went to where Obama was, and Obama was really careful. He has this great true smile. At least he did until he became president and had to deal with everything. But he had this great true smile, but he really was careful not to overuse it. He tried to keep it as natural as possible. And I thought that was interesting. Another thing was I did some work for Bayer at one point looking at TV commercials. And of course, they don't have overly smooth professional actors. They're calling in some actors, but they're not A-list.
Right.
And what we found when they correlated to sales was that when I looked at the quality of the acting, the more authentic it was and the more it fit the script as to what was being said and what was supposed to be going on as you moved from problem to solution as the format in the commercial, the more Bayer made money. And the less authentic it was, the less they made money, because if you don't believe the acting on some subliminal level, you probably don't believe in the product either.
So you're saying it's worth paying for that top line talent?
It is, and it's also worth doing more than one take if need be. And it's worthwhile to get rid of somebody who just can't seem to get there. Many years ago, I was speaking in Estonia, and I finished the speech. And the first question off the floor, someone says, you're an American. You smile all the time. Isn't it fake? And I said, can you unpack the question for me? They said, well, you have all your cheesy smiles on TV, all your advertising. And I said, well, I'm not responsible for that, nor am I that person. I actually happen to enjoy what I do for a living. There is something called the American dream. And since you were historically stuck between Hitler and Stalin, if you're not quite as happy, I'll forgive you for it.
Did they at least laugh?
They did. There was a gasp in the audience, though, because they probably didn't think an American might actually know history, but I did.
Well, it is interesting, though, because on a television or something, you're projecting. I mean, you are trying to sell something. Usually a doer presentation is not going to lead into much profit.
Yeah, no, it's true. But you also just want to be animated. So it is the smile, and people have to make their own calculation. I mean, the worst acting by far in any commercial is the people playing doctors in pharmaceutical ads.
Oh, sure.
I mean, those are just atrocious beyond belief. I mean, I've told them to deep six those a long time ago. But yeah, you're looking for the authenticity of the smile, but you're also looking to see if they emote much. If you're talking about the problem, you should feel the problem.
True.
You know, so that there's a contrast between the two. To have the Energizer bunny smile go for an entire 30 seconds is what I call being off emotion rather than being on emotion. You want to be on message and you want to be on emotion. Feeling points are just as important as talking points. I mean, they really are. And if you are animated, you show you care. You should have some variety. You should have some nuance to you. Otherwise, my God, you're just this plastic doll that's been put out before us.
You know, this is probably completely way off base, but I had a conversation recently with my wife, and there are romantic movies, and yes, okay, I watch them with my wife, and I actually enjoy them too, I confess. But they will have a character, and this is where I'm going with it, especially the male, where they will just be a real jerk. I mean, a deep, complete jerk. And I have trouble following the redemption arc. Is there a point where it could be too far? Where somebody like, and I'll use, God, I forgot the actor's name. He played Michael Scott in The Office, Steve Carell.
Oh, yeah, he's wonderful. I love watching The Office, by the way.
Exactly. Well, he's a jerk, but there's just this certain childlike quality to him to where you never feel like you hate the guy. You kind of still like him no matter how bad or how dumb or how terrible his statement is. Do you feel that is a factor? And I'm asking you this because like in commercials or whatever, if you express it too strongly or you're too far down a path, then you can't turn the other way. Does that make sense?
Well, his character is endlessly trying to get himself out of predicaments that he often created himself.
Sure.
So there is this frantic energy to him, and he's almost like he's emotionally ADD because he is pirouetting from one emotion and one circumstance to another. When you're talking about these bad guys, they're often rather sullen. And they don't express a lot, and they're pretty monolithic. Anger is probably the go-to emotion that they're going to show, maybe a contempt expression. There's nothing there that makes us root for them. Whereas in The Office, despite all their downsides and foibles, there's some sort of impish charm that brings us along. And it's not necessarily that there's too much smiling. It's just I think it's just the bubbling variety. I mean, we all like variety in life. It's one of the reasons we're watching TV after all. At the end of the day, we're looking for something different.
Actually,
fresh.
Another good one might be James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano.
Yeah, I don't know that I've watched it, but I don't know as well. I just watched The Office last night, a couple of episodes, for instance. So
well, that definitely holds up. But okay, back to the model of reading people. Joe Navarro, I think, has describe something that just makes so much sense to me, and it's very simple, but sometimes a simple thing is very profound. And he said it's a matter of finding comfort and discomfort, that all of body language is you find a baseline of comfort, and wherever they're showing discomfort is what you're seeking.
Well, in his line of work, that would make more sense, because he's looking for the disparities, something that gives away something they're not willing to offer up. He's basically playing Sherlock Holmes. What I'm tending to do in my work is, whether it's politics or market research or whatever the case may be, or just enjoying watching something that's a cultural artifact, is I'm really interested in two things. One is, what's the expression in the moment? Is there some interesting, revealing moment? I'll give you an example. So before the surge, I'm watching two generals testify about the Iraq war to Congress, and they're saying it's going well. And they actually look pretty fearful and pretty sad. And I say to myself, oh shit, this is a lot worse than we're learning about. And then, over time it comes out. So I'm interested in those revealing moments. I think there are those kind of revelatory opportunities. The other thing I'm really interested in, the ultimate pay dirt, is who is somebody over time? Do they indeed have a bit of a baseline, a default, what I call a signature expression that reveals something about them? So in another book that I did not too long ago called 2 Cheers for Democracy, I actually went through for every single president. It was a little difficult in the case of George Washington and really older presidents. I didn't have photographs. I had some paintings. I had some sculpture. I had medallions. I had to work with whatever I could find. It got a lot easier. I divided into 3 different eras, 3 different tranches, based basically on how the technology was evolving. I got a camera, but the camera's slow. Now I got a modern camera and so forth. And then I correlated what I picked up from them, what the patterns were for their emoting, to what presidential scholars had said about their greatness. How did they rank as one of the great presidents or one of the weaker presidents? And what I found over time was that sadness was the most reliable indicator of relative failure in the White House.
So that would imply that Lincoln failed.
Well,
sorry to say, but it immediately goes to mind. I can't think of anyone more profoundly sad.
Oh, absolutely. But the interesting thing about Lincoln is, one, he was the outlier among all the presidents who were most predominantly given to sadness, because there's never anything that's utterly precise or has no exceptions to the rule. But the other thing with Lincoln was that his secondary most standout emotion was a kind of a lower grade of happiness, because Lincoln also had a good ability to, be amused at himself, be amused at the foibles of others, to make the little wry joke. He could find some levity and happiness. I said earlier, one of the downsides of happiness is that it makes you sloppy with the details. The upside of happiness can be that it gives you more freedom of thought. There are good studies to indicate that a happier person will brainstorm superior solutions and more quickly. And I would say one of the attributes of Lincoln, despite the circumstances he found himself in, he had a very difficult marriage. One of his children died while he was in the White House. I mean, there is absolute sadness. I mean, I don't think a man like Lincoln couldn't have felt sadness and then produced, the Gettysburg Address. I mean, that is a really somber but incredible piece of writing. But I think the happiness was some levity. When I looked at the other presidents who were characterized by sadness, tended to be emotions like disgust and contempt. Anger were their secondary emotion. So there was not something to offset the sadness. Sadness and happiness is like the front and the back side of the moon. And I think those qualities helped Lincoln. And sadness was, if you want to talk about being on emotion, sadness really fit the Civil War. I mean, what a horrible spectacle that was.
Who was it that was known as a happy warrior?
Actually, Hubert Humphrey from my home state of Minnesota was known as the happy warrior.
Okay. Well, he didn't quite make it in. Well,
in 1968, you'd have to be crazy to be happy. That was a difficult year for the country. So Nixon, might have arguably been lucky. And Nixon was one of the presidents who was given to sadness.
Who surprised you when you're doing this research? I feel like things have to surprise you. Like you think one thing and then you discover something else.
I'll give you a couple of things. One from politics and one from culture. Fear and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan indexed really high on fear. And when I thought about Ronald Reagan, I thought about him being smiling and comfortable in his own skin. I thought of him as being angry and purposeful, like tear down that wall, Gorbachev, that sort of stuff. But when I looked at him, and I'm not saying those emotions aren't there, but when I put him relative to the other presidents, what really stood out was his degree of fear. And then I went back and I started reading the autobiographical information and the biographical information, and it made a lot more sense. His dad was an alcoholic. The family moved repeatedly when he was a boy. He always had to cover up like why he didn't want friends to come to the house and things like that. In adulthood, he was not a very successful actor. Jane Wyman dumped him and moved on. As a president, was he always in command of the facts? He might not have been, but it certainly became more difficult, once his, diminished mental abilities started to come into play. I don't remember the name of his condition offhand. I want to say dementia, but whatever it was that he was suffering from, was starting to loom over him later in his presidency. So he was, and I think it makes sense based on all those details and people saying that it was, despite all the sunniness, he was really hard to get close to. His son complained that he never once had an intimate conversation with his father ever. And more than a few people said that.
I hate to sidetrack, but you mentioned, dementia. I'm not going to say it is, but I do, from what I've seen, and I don't want to read any more into it, but I feel like there's something wrong with Biden.
Biden is, he feels like, to me, like he's on, a piece of soap. He is truly not all there. The energy level is really low. I do a blog series called Faces of the Week. And at one point after one of the debates, I think just before Iowa, I titled it, Biden Sinks Beneath the Waves.
Okay, I'm not, people are laughing. I don't think it's funny. I'm genuinely concerned when I look, and the snapping at voters, that anger sometimes is a sign of cognitive issues. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm not laughing at it either. I mean, maybe there's a little ironic humor in the title, but the stakes are big. I mean, I'm a patriot. I believe the country should have the best president it could possibly have at all times. I have a very famous cousin named Clint Hill. He's the one who tried to save Kennedy in Dallas in 1963. He was the Secret Service agent who jumped to the back of the limo and tried to get to the president.
Oh, wow.
And I've met with him several times, and quite honestly, Clint was a facial coder. He said I couldn't possibly, take in all the things going on in the audience. What I looked for was anger, because anger is an emotion, essentially means I'm going to hit or hit out. He said I was looking for someone with a strong anger expression if I could. The problem that day was,
They're
based
in a
on
window.
they're in a window up above. He had no chance. He had to have something much more on the level. So no, I do think there's something a little bit missing about Biden, and presuming he gets the nomination. Not since 1944 has it been so important as to who the vice presidential choice might be. My grandfather out in North Dakota was a lifelong Republican, but he voted for FDR for getting us out of the Great Depression. But he once said to me in a moment of aside, he said, "Yeah, the Democrats fooled us into voting for a dead man in 1944." And there's a little bit of truth to that. FDR.
Same thing with Wilson, though. He wasn't elected, but if I recall, there's some very serious speculation that his wife ran the country for at least the last bit.
Oh, no, there's no question about it. When he went around and tried to talk the country into agreeing to the League of Nations, he wore himself out and, had I believe it was a stroke. And yeah, his wife, Edith, was essentially the president for the last part of his time in office.
Okay, so.
And someone else who also surprised me, going a different direction, speaking of celebrities, Robert Redford. I thought of Robert Redford as just this handsome dude, fairly placid. And when I started looking at Redford, it's not that he's intensely angry, but he's angry. He didn't like the Hollywood system. It's why he created Sundance. He never wanted to just be a pretty face. He wanted to be something more than that. And, it's a kind of a low grade, more muted anger, but it really stood out for him. And that really caught me by surprise. Same thing I'd say with George Harrison. I happen to be a lifelong lover of the Beatles. I always thought of George as, the quiet Beatle, the guy who wrote, My Sweet Lord and, all these little gentle tunes. He really seemed like a gentle soul. But I started looking at his expressions, and George was angry. And maybe he was angry because he didn't get as many songs cut on the album.
Right.
But when I started doing the background reading, Ringo Starr said, yes, we go into the studio. And he said, I never knew which George I was going to get, because some days George could be a rather pleasant fellow, and other days George would be really, ornery. And he said, I had to watch out for the guy.
You know what's funny? I feel like the Beatles are a weird case. Like, number one, poor Ringo. I mean, how many times have I heard how awful of what was the old joke? What was it? The best drummer in the Beatles wasn't Ringo, or something like that.
Yeah, no, he gets picked on a fair amount, and Paul McCartney was such a good musician that arguably he was the best drummer and the best lead guitarist in the group, as well as doing everything else. But Ringo was charming, and the Beatles would not be the Beatles without Ringo.
Yeah, I kind of feel like sort of like John Entwistle in The Who was the glue between Pete Townsend and Keith Moon, because they were both so incendiary. His skill of holding down the bottom just kind of held them together.
Yeah, they needed something. When you got Keith Moon on the guitars, ready to blow up the world, you need something to have some glue there.
Well, any other celebrities, presidents, or anything else that just really jumped out at you as being completely against character?
I was actually surprised with Zuckerberg. I just thought he'd be a nerd and he wouldn't show a whole lot of emotion necessarily. He's a joybird. He's someone who indexes really high on when the muscle around the eye relaxes and you get the twinkle of the eye.
Really?
And yes,
I always thought he was kind of spectrum-y, to be honest.
Well, so did I. And I'm not saying that's not there, but again, I'm looking at the same thing is true with the celebrities. I got 173 of them across 4 different eras. So I'm looking for where are the expressions where they really stand out. So when I take on happiness, I actually look at 4 different levels of happiness. So I'm not saying he's a happy camper overall, because I have other levels. I have pleasure where the cheeks lift very broadly, a satisfaction expression where it's a more muted happiness, and then kind of the Filene's bargain basement of happiness, which I call acceptance. It's the begrudging smile where maybe one side of the mouth briefly flickers with the whisper of a smile. But what Zuckerberg does have is when he's really happy. And of course, he's made a lot of money. He's controlled his own destiny. When he's really happy, he goes to this joybird expression. And that's very different, for instance, from Jeff Bezos, whose signature expression is surprise. Bezos is all about seizing, in my opinion, seizing opportunities. His eyes go wide. He is engaged in reconnaissance a lot. What's the situation? What should I do? What should I do with something? So they're both tech giants. I never would have thought about either one of them as being particularly emotive beings. I could not have readily identified before the study that these would be their signature expressions, the ones that most stood out, where they indexed most highly versus the other celebrities I looked at.
Well, okay, I'm going to go through a couple more. I'd hope you look, because when you talk about tech giants, I can't help but go to Steve Jobs.
Anger.
Okay, I thought there was a rage within him.
Absolutely. I was speaking at a conference not long ago, and then the guy after me got up and he starts in and he shows a photograph of Steve Jobs, and he's talking about all the sweetness of Steve Jobs' creations, in terms of the ease of using the iPhone and everything else. And that's fine. I mean, they are wonderful products, arguably. But the guy is showing this photograph really large on the screen, and he says, so what do you notice about Steve Jobs? And I said, anger. And he said, where do you see anger? I said, well, look at how firmly pressed together the lips are. I said, in fact, there's a bulge beneath the lower lip, right in the middle beneath the lower lip. I said, that's a really reliable sign of anger. So are when the eyes narrow and you get a taut lower eyelid. I said, that's also really reliable sign of anger. I said, that's Steve Jobs. That's the guy you're showing me. And this person just didn't want to accept it. I mean, but if you start reading about Steve Jobs and how he treated other people, the fact that he would take a handicapped parking spot and just park there and jump out and, screw you, this is where I'm going to park. I mean, it fits very much. I can't say that one surprised me especially, but I hadn't really zeroed in on him that much until I did the study. And then I went, boom, yeah, anger, absolutely.
How about Elon Musk?
I don't remember offhand, but I'm going to say that I think there's some disgust there. I'd have to look it up. But it wasn't, again, I didn't have a reading of him going in. But whatever it wasn't what I remembered or what I expected, to the extent I expected something. There's a lot of surprises. It's, once you start studying something, you pick up things that casually you might just go with the press releases or the image or something.
Would it be disgust or contempt? I'm just curious because I feel like some of his actions are like he's amused by everyone who's below him a little.
Well, if you don't mind, I've just grabbed my book because I can't possibly remember.
Oh, I understand that.
Everybody. And the funny thing is I also asked people in a survey to say what they thought for a celebrity, and they were wildly off, like only 35% accurate.
Oh, that's me.
So
on the bottom end of the Moravian.
So for Elon Musk, what the people thought was happiness. In fact, they thought it was going to be really strong happiness. And his number one highest thing, I was correct. It's disgust, followed by contempt.
Okay, why was it that far off?
And they're both aversive emotions. The difference is disgust is the upper lip flares, the nose wrinkles. It's really a really kind of a gut level reaction. I see it a lot in star athletes. They can't stand mediocrity. It's
that makes sense.
It's almost as if it repulses them. Contempt, on the other hand, is what you were going to. It's more attitudinal in nature. It can be, I don't trust you. I don't respect you. I'm superior to you.
I've heard that contempt is to people and disgust is to things.
That can often be true. I mean, the way that disgust serves us from an evolutionary point of view is our ancestors would have said, this is a bad watering hole. The water's fetid. I'm going to get poisoned. I'm going to get sick. I'm going to die from this.
Right.
We don't like the taste of an apple and so on. Contempt to me is an odd one because just as surprise is almost like a pre-emotion, the other emotion that doesn't quite fit in is contempt, which is really almost a cognitive emotion, which is a contradiction in terms. But I really think it's attitudinal in nature, and it builds up over time, often in relationships. It's why at the Love Lab at the University of Washington, Seattle, they use facial coding in marriage counseling. with 15 minutes of videotape, a 90% accuracy rate as to whether or not the couple would stay married. And contempt was the most reliable indicator that it would fail.
I read, I think that same study, though, said it was contempt with men and disgust with women.
It could be.
Like women who showed disgust, their relationship was in serious trouble. And men who showed contempt, it was over. Something like that.
Well, if it's true, disgust would be interesting because women are much more sensitive to smells, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at a study, you take 100 smells, the women will have a more acute sense of smell for like 97 of them. I mean, they just beat guys. Yeah. So why are they a better cook in many cases? That could be a reason. Do they like it if your dirty T-shirt's in the corner of the bedroom and you haven't picked it up for 4 days and put it in the clothes hamper? Yeah. So if women feel disgust, it could be at times with the habits of the guys in their household. It's just possible. But overall, contempt makes a lot of sense because if you no longer respect the other party, you also don't put any credence in what they're saying. I mean, what happens in a presidential debate? The first thing you try to do is undercut the authority of the other person.
Sure.
Try to say they're not trustworthy. You shouldn't listen to them because once you've defanged them, you're kind of home safe as a candidate. And I think it's a really hard thing to recover from, once it goes down. I mean, just today in a book I was reading over lunchtime, they said essentially George Bush's presidency was over after Katrina. He couldn't come back from it.
Well, Trump, and I know you're not a fan, you did a whole thing on him, but he handled that masterfully throughout the debates, and he undercut everybody in just one phrase or another. Low energy Jeb. He took a quality of Jeb Bush of being very contemplative, serious and sober and thoughtful, and he turned it into, if you will, a description that he couldn't escape, because once that label was planted on him, however he tried to get out of it, either he would be overreacting, which means he stepped into it, or he would be still low energy and he stepped into it. So however you feel about Trump, he's a master at laying paint on other people.
No, he absolutely is. And it's true that I don't have a high regard for his character or his competency in office. On the other hand, I just finished reading a book called An Audience of One, widely regarded as an excellent book on Trump. And it's written by the television critic at the New York Times. And Trump is a creature of watching TV. He obviously was on TV. He really understands the medium. And yes, he's very good at the put downs and the comebacks. He knows how to phrase things in a way that is memorable, that's punchy, that has, especially if you're on his side, an element of humor to it. And he was brilliant regarding Jeb Bush. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, he announced his presidency the very day after Jeb Bush announced his. The whole point was to be the counterpoint to Jeb Bush. And he was very fortunate in Hillary Clinton as a candidate. I mean, just as, Nixon was lucky that 1968 was a year where his kind of glowering presence was perfect for the time when the whole country was falling apart. And Hubert Humphrey's happiness looked like, aren't you paying attention, guy? Don't you see what's going on here? At the same time, I think that Trump's ability to counterpunch and take it to Hillary Clinton, who had a massive problem with fake smiles. I mean, I actually named the Guillotine Smile after watching Hillary Clinton, on the stump, because she did it all the time. She would smile broadly, not so genuinely, and then put it away. So I thought Trump had a lot of things going for him as a campaigner, actually. But I'd say as a campaigner versus being in the White House, from my point of view, can be different skill sets at times.
Well, sure. But it's one of those that even a broken clock is, right twice a day.
Yeah. No, but he has some skills, and he does have amazing amount of energy. You have to give it to him for that. I mean, he was the absolute opposite of Jeb Bush, who just slowly slid from being in the middle of the debate stage further and further to the side. It was so humiliating. It was amazing.
And the other one that he did that really stands out on him, I don't know if you've ever read Scott Adams or know of him, but he pointed it out. But when Megyn Kelly went after him with essentially a nuclear bomb, I mean, just, you've said this and this and this about women. I mean, any candidate I've ever seen would be stammering and trying to find their way out of it. But he just looked up and goes, only Rosie O'Donnell, and the whole audience just started laughing. And that was scarily masterful.
It was. Well, Roy Cohn trained him to say, if they punch back twice as hard. And he took that to heart. He's applied it his whole adult career. But he's always, as the book I just alluded to said, well, we talk about breaking news. Well, the breaking news is anything off the lips of Donald Trump, whether it's a tweet or something he actually says. He just keeps rolling and rolling, and nothing seems to set him back, even when it could and should, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, it's I'm going to leave it on one point, but I think it's probably very true, and that is that Trump's fan base take him seriously, but not literally, and his opposition takes him literally, but not seriously.
Yeah, and that's their fault not to take him seriously, for one thing. It's a real presidency, and it has real ramifications, and they underestimated him. I would confess I did as well initially. And then I watched a documentary that he'd been toying with running for president for far longer than I imagined. In fact, had sat down with Richard Nixon after a fundraiser in Houston, and basically, buttonholed him with questions about what it took to get to the White House. The moment I read that, I said, no, this is not a Ross Perot where I'm going to disappear in the middle of the campaign for a while and be all quirky. This guy, he'll run it in a different way. But he's coming. He's coming at it. He means to try to win.
All right. Well, now to wrap things up, we've been talking a lot, I feel, about your book and Famous Faces Decoded. Is that pretty much everything we were talking about has been covered in that book, right?
It is that book and a book called Two Cheers for Democracy.
Two Cheers.
So I would say it's both of those books.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to recommend so people can go get those books because, we're talking about all this stuff and I know that's only scratching the surface. I think you told me earlier before we started 170 some odd pages of pictures, just literally showing how the expressions break down.
Yes, I have little pop quizzes. One of my fun things I do is I go through and I look at people in marriages or siblings and how they emote differently. So I tried to bring as much as I could, from rock stars to Hollywood to politicians to business people, media moguls, anything that I just said, I'm too intrigued not to go to that person.
Okay, and I wanted to close out. You had mentioned that if we ever get together in person, we'll be running what you called our EQ retreats. Now, what are those?
Yeah, EQ, obviously emotional intelligence. I have a really unique database. I've done work for more than half the world's top 100 business to consumer companies. I've done all sorts of other studies just because I'm a curious guy, and sometimes I can't resist. So I winter in Palm Springs area. I'm going to do, starting probably next, Q1 of 2021. I'm going to start doing these one-day business retreats, but they're not all business. Some of them will be lessons I've learned from facial coding and about emotions regarding advertising and sales and how to manage people and hire people and be a good leader. But I'm also going to do it for artists. I have, for instance, another book called First Blush, People's Intuitive Reactions to Famous Art, and how people respond to artwork. So I'm going to do it for them. It could be people in marriages or how to raise their kids. There are so many ways in which emotions apply. One of my favorite quotes is someone said, there are only two currencies in life, Dan, dollars and emotions. And I've sometimes worked them together, but I'm just interested in emotions, period. Human nature is fascinating. It's frustrating and it's fascinating both at the same time. There's a comment by Søren Kierkegaard, the famous Danish philosopher. He said, out of the twisted timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. So I have spent the last 20 years kind of looking for the warp in the woods and the knots, just because, hey, it's interesting stuff.
Well, very cool. And I am doing something that's a live stream where I bring on guests who've been on the show and open things up to where the audience can ask questions in the chat. And I was wondering if it's possible we could maybe bring you back and maybe you could kind of demonstrate your tool and we could go over a couple pictures or something and you could, show us this is what I'm seeing here and this is how it work. And I, fast forward, zoom in, all that stuff. Is that possible? We can bring you back?
Oh, absolutely. I would be delighted to do that. It can be from photographs, from video, whatever you want to do. Yeah, I love to apply my trade. I've done it day in, day out for years.
Oh, fantastic. And people can find you at sensorylogic.com, right?
That is my company's website. I also have a personal one called danhill.sensorylogic.com. Either one will work. And there is my blog called Faces of the Week.
Well, fantastic. And Dan, thank you so much for coming on.
I had a great time. Thank you for the conversation.